It started as just another NICU awareness segment on The Tonight Show until a neonatal intensive care nurse revealed that after 22 years of listening for the life-saving cries of premature babies, she could no longer hear the sounds that meant survival. The Tonight Show studio was filled with the tender, reverent energy that came from Jimmy Fallon's commitment to highlighting the miraculous work done in neonatal intensive care units and the healthcare professionals who dedicated their lives to saving the smallest, most vulnerable patients. Tonight's focus was on NICU care and the specialized nurses who provided round-the-clock attention to premature babies fighting for their first breaths, and Jimmy had assembled a panel of neonatal specialists, NICU families, and healthcare advocates who understood the delicate balance between life and death that played out in incubators every day. The segment was designed to educate viewers about the critical care required for premature infants while honoring the nurses and doctors who possess the specialized skills, infinite patience, and emotional strength required to care for babies who weighed less than 2 pounds and whose survival depended on constant vigilance and expert medical intervention. Among the guests was Janet Morrison, a 46-year-old woman who had been working as a neonatal intensive care nurse at Children's Hospital for over 2 decades. Janet was a petite woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing scrubs decorated with tiny cartoon animals that immediately identified her as someone who worked with the tiniest patients. And there was something about her gentle presence that conveyed both strength and infinite tenderness. Her eyes held the kind of alertness that came from years of watching for the subtlest changes in fragile patients. But there was also a subtle way she tilted her head and leaned forward when others spoke, as if straining to catch every word that suggested something fundamental had changed about how she experienced the auditory world that was so crucial to her work. Janet represented the thousands of NICU nurses across America who specialized in caring for premature infants, babies born too early whose survival depended on advanced medical technology, and the watchful eyes and trained ears of healthcare professionals who could detect the smallest changes in condition that might signal medical emergencies or improvements. Jimmy had invited Janet to share insights about NICU nursing, perhaps discuss the incredible advances in neonatal care that had dramatically improved survival rates for premature babies, or talk about the emotional rewards and challenges of working with the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. It was supposed to be an inspiring conversation about medical miracles and the dedication of healthcare professionals. But as Jimmy began the interview, something in Janet's demeanor immediately suggested that this would be more than a simple celebration of neonatal nursing achievements. "Janet," Jimmy said with his characteristic warmth, 22 years as a NICU nurse. That's an extraordinary career dedicated to caring for the most vulnerable patients imaginable. Tell us what drew you to this specialized field of nursing." Janet smiled, but there was a profound sadness in her expression that seemed incongruous with someone discussing work that saved lives every day. "Well, Mr. Fallon, I became a NICU nurse because I was born premature myself at 28 weeks, and I spent the first 3 months of my life in intensive care. My mother always told me that the NICU nurses were the reason I survived, and I wanted to give that gift to other families." The audience was immediately quiet, understanding the deeply personal nature of Janet's calling. "That's beautiful," Jimmy said. "What's it been like, spending 22 years caring for premature babies? What does a typical day in the NICU involve?" Janet's expression became more serious as she considered how to explain the intensity and precision required for her work. Mr. Fallon, caring for premature babies requires constant vigilance. These infants weigh between 1 and 4 pounds. Their lungs aren't fully developed, their immune systems are fragile, and their survival depends on our ability to monitor every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle change in their condition. Jimmy leaned forward, clearly impressed by the level of skill and attention required for Janet's work. In the NICU, Janet continued, we rely heavily on sound to monitor our patients. We listen for changes in their breathing patterns, variations in heart rate monitors, the specific cries that indicate hunger versus pain versus distress. A baby's cry can tell us if they're developing an infection, if they're having difficulty breathing, if they need immediate medical intervention. The studio was growing quieter as the audience began to understand the critical importance of auditory sensitivity in neonatal nursing. Janet, Jimmy said, in 22 years, how many premature babies have you cared for? Janet paused, calculating numbers that clearly carried enormous emotional weight. Over 4,000 babies, Mr. Fallon. 4,000 premature infants who came into this world too early, fighting for every breath, depending on technology and human expertise to help them grow strong enough to go home to their families. Jimmy was clearly moved by the scope of life-saving care that Janet had provided throughout her career. 4,000 babies. That's incredible. How many of those babies survived because of the care you provided? Janet's expression showed both pride and deep concern. The vast majority survived, Mr. Fallon. Advances in neonatal care have dramatically improved survival rates for premature babies. But my ability to provide that level of care is now compromised in a way I never anticipated. Jimmy's expression shifted to concern as he sensed that Janet was leading toward something difficult. What do you mean? Jimmy asked gently. Janet touched her ears, a gesture that seemed both unconscious and painful. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something profound and devastating. Mr. Fallon, Janet said, I can't hear the babies crying anymore. The studio fell completely silent. Jimmy's expression showed growing alarm as he processed what Janet had just revealed. What's causing your hearing loss? Jimmy asked softly. Janet looked down at her hands, then back at Jimmy. 22 years of constant exposure to high-frequency baby cries, medical equipment alarms, ventilator sounds, and the acoustic environment of the NICU has caused significant hearing damage, particularly in the frequency ranges that are most critical for infant care. The audience was stunned into silence, many of them beginning to understand that they were witnessing the end of a career built entirely on auditory vigilance and sensitivity. It started about 18 months ago with difficulty hearing the higher-pitched cries that premature babies make, Janet continued, her voice beginning to break. I thought it was just fatigue from long shifts, but audiology testing revealed significant hearing loss in precisely the frequency ranges that babies use to communicate distress. Jimmy was openly emotional now, understanding that Janet was describing the loss of the fundamental sense her profession required. Premature babies have very specific cry patterns that indicate different needs, Janet explained, tears now flowing freely. A hungry cry sounds different from a pain cry, which sounds different from a distress cry indicating breathing problems. If I can't distinguish between these sounds, I can't provide appropriate care. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the lighting seemed loud. Jimmy's face showed the devastating impact of Janet's confession. 6 months ago, Janet continued, I was caring for a 26-week premature baby who developed respiratory distress during my shift. Normally, I would have heard the subtle changes in her breathing pattern that indicated she was in trouble, but I missed the auditory cues because of my hearing loss. Another nurse had to point out that the baby needed immediate intervention. Jimmy could see that Janet was tormented by the idea that her hearing loss might compromise patient safety. 3 months ago, Janet said, now speaking with obvious difficulty as emotion overwhelmed her, I was working with twins born at 24 weeks, and one of them was crying in a way that should have immediately alerted me to feeding difficulties. I didn't hear the specific cry pattern that indicated the problem, and the baby became dehydrated before we realized what was happening. Jimmy stood up and walked closer to Janet, understanding that she was mourning not just the end of her career, but the loss of her ability to protect the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. Janet, Jimmy said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, you've spent 22 years using your ears to save the lives of premature babies. The fact that this constant exposure to medical sounds has affected your hearing doesn't diminish the incredible care you've provided. Janet looked at Jimmy with tears streaming down her face. Mr. Fallon, there are premature babies in the NICU right now whose survival depends on nurses who can hear the subtle changes in their condition. Every shift I work where I can't hear accurately is a shift where babies might not receive the immediate attention they need. Jimmy could see that Janet was devastated by the idea that her disability might compromise the life-saving care that premature infants required. When you say you can't hear the babies crying anymore, Jimmy asked, what does that mean for your future as a NICU nurse? Janet looked around the studio, then back at Jimmy. Next month, I'm transferring out of the NICU to a different nursing unit. After 22 years of listening for the life-saving cries of premature babies, I have to step away because I can no longer trust my ears to hear what these vulnerable patients are trying to tell me. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, what Janet is describing represents something we rarely discuss about healthcare professions. The very environment that enables nurses to save lives can, over time, affect their ability to continue providing that level of care. He turned back to Janet. But Janet, before you step away from NICU nursing, I want to show you something. I want you to understand what 22 years of listening for life has meant to the families whose babies you've helped bring home. Janet looked confused. What do you mean? Jimmy walked to his desk and picked up his phone. Janet, you mentioned that you've cared for over 4,000 premature babies. What if we could show you the impact of your vigilant care? What if we could connect you with some of the families whose babies survived because of your ability to hear what they needed? Jimmy looked into the camera. We're putting out a call right now. If Janet Morrison cared for your premature baby at Children's Hospital, if her expertise helped your child survive their earliest, most vulnerable days, we want to hear from you. Use the hashtag #ThankYouJanet and share how her care made the difference in your baby's survival. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media was flooded with testimonials from families whose premature babies had been cared for by Janet over her 2-decade career. Stories poured in from across the region of children who were now thriving because of Janet's vigilant nursing care during their first critical weeks of life. But Jimmy had arranged something even more powerful. Over the following week, his production team worked to track down some of the families whose premature babies Janet had cared for during her most challenging cases, people who wanted to thank her personally for the life-saving attention she had provided. The next week, Jimmy invited Janet back to the show for what she thought would be a follow-up conversation about supporting nurses with occupational hearing loss. Instead, he had arranged something unprecedented. Janet, Jimmy said as she sat carefully on stage, you told me that you're heartbroken about the babies you can no longer hear. Tonight I want you to meet some of the children whose first cries you heard and responded to, even though they may need to speak a little louder for you to hear them clearly now. One by one, families whose premature babies Janet had cared for were brought on stage via video call to thank her personally. First was Sarah Martinez, whose daughter Janet had cared for when she was born at 25 weeks, 8 years earlier. "Janet," Sarah said, speaking clearly so Janet could hear, "you probably don't remember, but you were my daughter Emma's primary nurse when she was born, weighing just 1 pound, 12 ounces. Janet stared at the screen with growing recognition, leaning forward to hear better. Emma Martinez. She was so tiny, and she had such a distinctive cry when she was hungry. "That's right," Sarah replied. "Janet, you saved Emma's life multiple times during her 4-month NICU stay. You were always the one who could tell what she needed just by listening to her. You heard things that other nurses missed." Tears were streaming down Janet's face as she remembered the long nights caring for the fragile infant. "Because of your incredible ear for what babies need," Sarah continued, "Emma not only survived but thrived. She's now a healthy 8-year-old who loves to sing. Every note she hits reminds me that you were the one who first heard her voice and knew how to help her." Next was Michael and Jennifer Rodriguez, whose twin sons Janet had cared for when they were born at 27 weeks 5 years earlier. "Janet," Michael said, "you cared for our boys during the scariest time of our lives. They were born at less than 2 pounds each, and we were told their survival was uncertain." Janet was crying as she strained to hear their words, remembering the complex care required for the premature twins. David and Daniel Rodriguez. They had different cry patterns, and one of them always needed extra attention with feeding. "Exactly," Jennifer replied. "Janet, you were the only nurse who could tell our identical twins apart by their cries. You knew which one was David and which one was Daniel just by listening to them. Your ability to hear the differences in their needs probably saved both their lives." The testimonials continued for over an hour. A mother whose 23-week baby had survived because Janet detected early signs of infection through changes in crying patterns. A father whose daughter was now a healthy teenager because Janet's acute hearing had identified breathing problems that other medical equipment hadn't caught. A family whose premature triplets had all survived their in-ICU stay under Janet's vigilant care. Each story revealed not just Janet's technical nursing skills, but her extraordinary ability to use her hearing as a diagnostic tool, her sensitivity to the subtle variations in premature infant behavior that could